Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AOAC CASP Training and Education Heavy Metals Workgroup Training Session. I'm going to kick off the session with a talk on regulations for heavy metals in cannabis and hemp, and how the industry has been predominantly guided by the pharmaceutical industry. So let me dive right in by giving you an overview of my talk. I'll kick it off with the current status of heavy metal regulations for cannabis and hemp, particularly the limitations of a fractured state-based system. I'll then focus on how the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industries approach regulating elemental impurities and how they abandoned the 100-year-old semi-quantitative colorimetric method and replaced it with modern instrumental techniques. I'll also offer my perspective on what the cannabis and hemp industry can learn from this process and give my thoughts on how the industry should move forward with federal oversight around the corner. So where is cannabis legal in the US today? Here's a map of the US with light green representing states where medicinal cannabis is legal and dark green where both recreational and medicinal is legal. It is legal for medicinal use in 36 states, with 14 of them also allowing for recreational use. However, many of the other states are going through the legalization process, so this map could look very different in 12 months. Most of the 36 states have heavy metals limits. Majority of the states just specify 4 heavy metals known as the Big Four: lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury. Maryland adds chromium, selenium, silver, and barium, while New York includes nickel, chromium, antimony, zinc, and copper. Oregon has no heavy metal limits at all. So let's take a more detailed look at some of the individual states. This is a table of heavy metal maximum limits for 7 different states: California, Colorado, Oregon, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, compared to United States Pharmacopoeia Chapter 232, permitted daily exposure limits, often called PDE limits, for elemental impurities in drug products, together with USP Chapter 2232, PDE limits for dietary supplements, and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia limits for heavy metals in botanicals and herbal products. A couple of points to emphasize. USP Chapter 232 defines a total of 24 elemental impurities based on the drug delivery method: oral, parenteral, intravenous, and inhalation, while Chapter 2232 only defines the Big Four heavy metals in dietary supplements. So in this table, 12 of those elements have been included to reflect the Big Four plus the additional elements in Maryland and New York. It's very important to emphasize that Chapter 232 limits in this table are based on microgram per day. So to know what's allowable in the actual drug or supplement, these limits must be recalculated based on the suggested daily dosage for that particular drug or supplement. For example, if the maximum dosage is 10 grams per day, these limits must be divided by 10 to convert them to microgram per gram in the drug or supplement. Let's take a closer look at 3 other states which emphasize the fractured nature of the regulations. Let's begin with California. California was the first state to regulate cannabis in 1996, and as a result, it is considered the gold standard with regard to cannabis regulations. California limits are defined in microgram per gram in 2 different categories: inhalation cannabis products and all other cannabis products. So these are the same as USP Chapter 232 PDE limits for inhaled and all drugs respectively, based on 10 grams of consumption per day. It's also worth pointing out that even though pharmaceutical PDEs are based on 10 grams of suggested dosage per day, we really have no way of knowing in what quantities people consume cannabis products. Here are the limits for Colorado, which are a little more complex than California. Colorado limits are categorized by heavy metals of interest in the first column, acceptable limits in the second, and products to be tested in the third column. The acceptable limits are defined in part per million in the product and not microgram per gram. Besides inhaled and oral, they also include limits for transdermal products via the skin. The limits for inhaled products are based on USP Chapter 232 PDE levels for inhalation drugs, but the limits for oral products are based on USP Chapter 2232 for dietary supplements. However, the topical values are based on FDA limits for heavy metals in cosmetics. Note, these values are based on an acceptable limit for 1 gram of intended use and not 10 gram as in California. Here are the limits for Connecticut. They're defined a little differently because they are based on a microgram of the heavy metal contaminant per kilogram of user body weight per day. So it's very difficult to get a good understanding what this really means with regard to maximum daily consumption because it's only based on body weight of the consumer. However, in toxicology studies, very often a typical body weight of 60 to 70 kilograms is used, but you still need to know what is the recommended consumption per day of cannabis product to make the calculation of the heavy metal maximum allowable limit. So let's talk more about PDEs defined in USP Chapter 232. Here is a full list of USP Chapter 232 PDE limits, which are based on maximum limits in microgram per day for 24 elemental impurities in the drug compound per delivery method. So for a suggested maximum daily dosage of 10 gram, these limits should be divided by 10. Note, Chapter 232 limits are the same as the ones defined in ICH Q3D guidelines for element impurities. For those of you who are not familiar with the ICH, it is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, which is a consortium representing the global pharmaceutical industry, include the United States, European, and Japanese pharmacopoeias. Here are the USP Chapter 2232 PD limits. These specifically give maximum limits per day for dietary supplements only. It should be emphasized that this chapter also addresses different forms of arsenic and mercury because of the potential of different arsenic species in plant-based botanical supplements, as well as the potential of methyl mercury in fish oil or kelp-based products as a result of conversion of elemental mercury to methyl mercury by many fish and aquatic species by the process of bioaccumulation. At this point of the presentation, I'd like to give you a little background of the United States Pharmacopoeia because I think it's important. USP is an independent, non-profit organization which is not part of the US government. However, it works very closely with government agencies, ministries, and regulatory authorities around the world. The mission of the USP is to improve the health of people through public standards to ensure the quality, safety, and purity of medicines, dietary supplements, and foods. USP standards have ensured consistency for drug products throughout the world for close to 200 years and are recognized in more than 130 countries. These standards, known as United States Pharmacopoeia National Formulary, or USPNF for short, is a book of public standards for drug substances, dosage forms, compounded preparations, excipients, medical devices, and dietary supplements. The FDA designates the USPNF as the official compendium for drugs sold and marketed in the US, which must conform to these standards to avoid possible charges of adulteration and misbranding. So what is the USP process to change a standard method or specification? USP continually revises standards through a unique public-private collaborative process which involves scientists and industry, academia, and government, as well as other interested parties. The American Chemical Society was one of the interested parties who worked with USP to update Chapter 231. I lead the Heavy Metals Task Force on the ACS Reagent Chemicals Committee. The test for heavy metals was described in USP Chapter 231 which was first introduced in 1908 and is very similar to the ACS test. The test relies on precipitation of the metal sulfide in a sample and compares the color intensity to a lead standard. USP felt that it was time to replace Chapter 231 with methodology that reflected modern test methods and updated toxicology data. So let's briefly explain USP Chapter 231 in greater detail. It is based on a sulfide precipitation of the analyte elements using an organosulfur compound and assumes that all analytes behave in a similar manner to a lead standard which samples are compared to. It is semi-quantitative at best that was initially intended to detect a small group of heavy metals, but there was no clear definition of which individual elements the method was detecting. It is well recognized to have many limitations, so it's pretty amazing that it has survived over 100 years. So what are the limitations of USP Chapter 231? This slide shows the colored sulfide precipitates of 12 different heavy metals. Imagine if all 12 elements are present in the sample, how difficult it would be to compare the color to the lead standard, which is encircled in red. Some of its limitations include it cannot detect individual heavy metals. Typically 5 ppm is the limit of detection. It's very labor intensive. Interpretation of the color varies with the experience of the analyst, and it needs a larger sample size of approximately 5 grams to work properly. So let's look at the timeline to change this method. It began in 1995, where a USP Pharmacopoeia forum identified issues with the Chapter 231 method. Then in 2000, an article in the journal Pharmaceutical and Biomedical Analysis proposed ICP-MS as an instrumental alternative. In 2004, an article in the same journal showed major recovery issues with USP Chapter 231 compared to ICP-MS. However, it took approximately 12 years of various expert committees, expert panels, working groups, and stakeholder meetings to implement these proposed changes. Yeah, USP definitely works very slowly. In January 2018, all 3 USP chapters and ICH Q3D guidelines were finally approved and adopted. So how did USP and ICH propose the design and scope of implementation of these new PDE limits? They decided it was important to have a chapter specifically for pharmaceuticals only. They called this Chapter 232. They wanted to separate dietary supplements from pharmaceuticals since they are regulated differently in the US and other regions around the world. They call this Chapter 2232. They wanted to simplify the harmonization process between USP and ICH by separating Chapter 232 and Chapter 2232 limits from the analytical procedure which they described in Chapter 233, which focuses on the plasma spectrochemistry techniques, ICP-OES or ICP-MS, microwave digestion procedure, and a full list of validation protocols. So let's talk more about the classification of elemental impurities. This is a slide of PDEs defined in Chapter 232 in microgram per day for the 3 different drug delivery systems, oral, parenteral, and inhalation. But this time I'd like to emphasize the first column, which is the class of elemental impurity. Class 1 includes the classic heavy metals, lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, which are known human toxicants that have no use in the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. These should be evaluated at all times. Class 2A elements have a high probability of occurrence in the drug product and also should be evaluated at all times. Class 2B elements have a reduced probability of occurrence related to the low abundance, and as a result can be excluded unless they are intentionally added during the manufacture of the drug product. Class 3 have relatively low toxicity by the oral route of administration, but could warrant consideration for inhalation and intravenous routes. So what elemental impurities could potentially end up in the drug products? They identify 4 potential sources. First one, elements intentionally added in the formulation of the drug substance. Examples of these include platinum group metal catalysts, which are often used in the organic synthesis of some drugs. Elements that are not intentionally added and are potentially present in the preparation of the drug product. Examples of this might include talcum powder, which is primarily used for tablet compression. Talc is basically magnesium silicate that is mined from the earth, so it can potentially contain high levels of certain heavy metals. Elements that are potentially introduced into the drug substance from the manufacturing equipment itself. Examples of this include the leaching out of chromium, nickel, and iron from stainless steel mixing or storage vessels. And elements that have the potential to be leached into the drug product from the plastic storage containers or closure systems. The bottom line was that regulators required the pharmaceutical industry to have a comprehensive understanding of elemental impurities in all its drug products. So with this as background information, let's now take a closer look at the sources of heavy metals in cannabis. So there are three major potential sources of elemental contaminants derived from the growing of cannabis and production of cannabinoid products. They are cultivation sources from the soil, fertilizers, and pesticides in outdoor cultivation, or from the grow medium, water, nutrients, growth enhancers from indoor or hydroponic cultivation. Process and manufacturing sources, including extraction and purification procedures, cutting blending equipment surfaces, mixing containers, storage vessels, plus edible product recipe ingredients and tablet or capsule formulations. And finally, delivery sources include devices such as vaping pens, inhalers, patches, and dropper bottles. So let's take a closer look at what elements could potentially be of concern in the growing of cannabis and the manufacturing of cannabinoid products. First of all, it should be emphasized that if cannabis is grown indoors, under more controlled conditions, the plant typically has lower levels of heavy metals. However, if it is grown outdoors, there are about 15 heavy metals found in natural ecosystems, and contamination from industrial activities such as mining, metal refineries, petrochemical plants, power plants, and cement works, etc., that could be potential sources of contaminants in the plant. Also, decades of using leaded paint and leaded gasoline has left its mark on the environment. The list of elements shown here are the ones taken from evidence in the public domain of heavy metals being taken up at various levels by cannabis and hemp plants. It is also the potential of the contamination, the concentration of the elemental contaminants during the extraction and purification of the cannabinoids. If it's in the plant and the flowers, there is a very good chance it will end up to some degree in the extract. In addition, the manufacturing process could add to this list based on metallic equipment used to grind, extract, and purify the cannabinoids, such as nickel, chromium, and iron from stainless steel containers. To emphasize this point, there have been multiple product recalls over the past 6 to 12 months for elevated levels of heavy metals. Let's take a closer look at a few examples. There was a case recently where a CBD oil producer from Florida was forced to recall a CBD tincture by the FDA because it had 10 times higher lead levels than the maximum allowable limits of Florida, 5 microgram per gram instead of 0.5 microgram per gram. 13 strains of medical marijuana sold at a licensed medical center in Michigan were recalled because they were contaminated with high levels of cadmium and arsenic. Medical cannabis regulators in Maryland issued an advisory to notify patients of potential lead contamination of cannabis liquids in vape cartridges following exposure to heat inside the device. There have been many more examples reported in the public domain. So let me finish by summarizing my thoughts on future regulations for heavy metals in cannabis. The current list of 4 heavy metals, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, is clearly inadequate. However, the 24 elements required by the pharmaceutical industry would probably be an overkill. However, it's absolutely critical that the cannabis industry has a much better understanding about the many potential sources of heavy metals in its products. I think that elemental contamination derived from the cultivation and manufacturing process would warrant regulating at least an additional 12 elements. So a future federally regulated list of potential heavy metal contaminants in cannabis could include the big four, plus additional 8 elements required by Maryland and New York, plus an additional 4 elements based on evidence in the public domain, making a total of about 16 metals. A number of standards groups have listed other elemental contaminations in addition to the classic big four heavy metals to monitor in cannabis. This slide shows a summary of the four of those groups involved in writing methodologies for measuring heavy metals in cannabis. This is clearly telling the industry that at some point they need to be monitoring more than the big four to ensure consumer safety. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the list of 13 toxic elements in the NIST Canna QEP program, which is developing certified reference materials for cannabis and hemp. I thank you for your time, and I gladly take any questions at the end of this training session. Thank you.